This Sunday, we are coming to the end of a journey together. Now, first, there's one that I want to speak to personally. This journey that we have had together the last 3.5 years of me as your pastor here at First Christian Church. Obviously, our journey is not coming to an end in any meaningful sense for either the church or me. I am in the middle of search and hopefully will be called to a new church or some other form of service. Whatever my life calls me to, I know it will be still a ministry, since I believe firmly that all of us who have chosen to follow Jesus as disciples have a ministry to offer. And so I will be continuing in ministry in some form or fashion. And in the same way, you will also here at First Christian Church. And I hope that I will hear of wonderful things you all are doing here in Tuscaloosa, and to help continuing to be in fellowship with the wider denomination we all belong to, the disciples of Christ, and continuing to share the good news here in West Alabama. But when I say that we are coming to the end of a journey, I also mean that in the story we have been hearing from the Gospel of Luke, this Lenten season, for most of the Sundays of Lent, we have been hearing Jesus share parables or have encounters with people on the road. At the very first Sunday of Lent, we heard him set his face toward Jerusalem. He was in Galilee, near his home, and he turned and looked south towards the holy city, the center of his Jewish faith, and he prepared to go and celebrate the Passover, the great feast of liberation and freedom, in which the Jews remember the crossing of the Red Sea from slavery in Egypt and the first steps into freedom, where they walked through the waters on dry ground. And so Passover is one of the frames that we are looking at as Jesus approaches Jerusalem here. It's about to be Passover. And in the story today, the first sentence tells us he entered the city of Jericho and was passing through. Jericho, if you don't remember, is a city that sits right on the river, somewhat northeast of Jerusalem. And it's one of the first cities that the Israelites came to when they were entering the Holy Land, according to the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the scriptures that Jesus knew and grew up with and taught. And at Jericho, there was a great battle in which the Israelites fought the inhabitants. And there was a famous children's song, or spiritual perhaps. I think mostly we hear children sing it, of the walls of Jericho came a-tumbling down, a-tumbling down. So you may remember that story about Jericho. But in Jericho at that time, in the ancient days, there was a woman named Rahab, who it says was a notorious sinner. She was in fact a prostitute. But Rahab, a native of Jericho, helped the 2 spies who had come from the Israelite camp, hid them, and helped them climb down out of a window and escape Jericho to return to Moses and the other Israelites. Actually, I'm sorry, Joshua and the other Israelites. Moses had been left behind on the far side of the river at that point. But she had come to faith in God, the Lord of heaven and earth, the one God that the Israelites worshipped. And so she sided with them in the struggle. She went on to become an ancestor of King David. So there's so much going on as Jesus, who is also a descendant of King David and therefore a descendant of Rahab, enters Jericho and passes through, the way that the Israelites did in their way to fill the promised land. And the promised land that they continue to inhabit, these descendants of the original Israelites, the Jewish people, Jesus and his people, is of course under Roman domination. And the Roman practice of the territories they had conquered and made into provinces was to do what's called tax farming. They would hire people. They would actually allow people to bid on the taxes for their town or region. And someone would bid on the taxes for the next year or several years, and there would be an estimate of how many taxes, how much needed to be collected, how much money. And that tax collector would pay that up front so that the Romans would get that payment and know it was there. And then they would almost treat it like a loan so that the tax collector could collect over time. And then they could also collect the money from the people to repay themselves. The problem was there was no set terms to that collection, so that the tax collectors could charge exorbitant amounts beyond what the taxes should be for that period of time. They could charge an extra 1%, 2%, 20% if they thought they could get away with it. And so the tax collectors, who largely came from the local population, were despised and hated and thought of as sinners. They were, for lack of a better term, racketeers, like an organized crime syndicate in the modern day, but under the government's approval. And so the Jews hated their own people who would become tax collectors. And we meet a man in Jericho named Zacchaeus who has become a tax collector. And it says he was rich. So he's become rich by conspiring with the hated Romans, the occupiers, the empire. And he has gotten rich from his own people there in Jericho. That's the surface story. That's why he is despised, we see. Zacchaeus surprises us. Zacchaeus surprises us in this story. And if we can set the context a little bit more, I want to say why Zacchaeus is so surprising. And why, in fact, Zacchaeus, instead of being simply another person on the story, is in many ways should be seen as an icon of faith and discipleship. He also has a song about him, a children's song. Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. Remember this song? He climbed up in a sycamore tree, for the Lord he wanted to see. And that is indeed the story we hear. He climbs a sycamore tree, that detail, a sycamore tree, to see Jesus. I wonder if some disciples, when they came through Jericho years later, would look at a tree on the road and say, "That's the tree Zacchaeus climbed. That's where Jesus stopped and pointed up to Zacchaeus and told him, 'Hurry down, because I'm coming to lunch at your house.'" At any rate, this little man, this tax collector, this despised but wealthy member of the community, wants to see Jesus. He runs ahead. He climbs a tree like a child. He is not even worried about his reputation or appearance. He climbs a tree so he can see Jesus. And Jesus sees him. In the chapters before this, in the last 2 chapters of Luke, we've heard some of these stories. We've heard about a rich man. A rich man who asked Jesus, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus, knowing that this rich man was captivated in captivity to his possessions, said, "Sell everything you have and give it to the poor, and then come and follow me." And that rich man couldn't do it. He couldn't give up the material wealth that Jesus said he needed to give up. And then we heard the story of the prodigal son, this wasteful son who asked for his half of his father's inheritance before his father's death and then wastes it all and has to return begging to his father. and about the older brother, the not wasteful brother, who is also in captivity to that wealth, to that relationship with his father's land and his father's acceptance, so that he cannot be happy about his younger brother's return. He can only think about how unfairly he's being treated. And then finally, last week we heard a parable about a man named Lazarus and a rich man, in which the rich man walks by Lazarus every day, this poor man who has sores all over his body and begs for crumbs to eat from the rich man's table, and the rich man simply ignores Lazarus. And they wind up in the underworld, the afterlife, because in Jesus' day the understanding was all of us went to a somewhat watery, dark realm in the afterlife. And it was just developing that there was an idea of some are punished and some exist in the bosom of Abraham, which was a somewhat new idea in Jesus' time. But that the poor man Lazarus was residing with Abraham and the rich man was suffering because he had ignored this poor brother of his, fellow child of Abraham, in his earthly life. And so now we have an example of another wealthy person. And instead of just thinking of him as a short person who climbs a tree and it becomes a cute story for children, I think we should see Zacchaeus as a real life answer to that parable and those brief stories, those parables and that brief story of encounter, and the other places in which Luke has shown us how wealth can be a trap, how privilege can be a trap, how comfort and station can be a trap. And even here in this story, we see how expectations about who belongs in and who belongs out becomes a trap. The people grumble because Jesus notices Zacchaeus and wants to go to his house. He has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner. It says they begin to grumble. They begin to grumble about Jesus. These people who have flocked to the roadway to see him now grumble at him when he upsets their expectations. But Jesus is there for that very purpose, to upset our expectations. And so he notices this tax collector in a tree. And he says, "Let's go to your house." And now Zacchaeus maybe surprises Jesus, but also maybe not. In our story, it sounds like Zacchaeus makes a change here because he has been noticed by Jesus. He says Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half my possessions I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." Again, it says, "I will give to the poor. I will pay back what I have defrauded." But in the original Greek, in the original text, it's not a story of reformation in the moment. It's a story of surprise that this hated tax collector actually already gives sacrificially, already does justice when he finds out he has acted on the side of injustice, because those are present tense verbs in the original Greek. They are in the present. He says, "I give to the poor. I give half of my wealth to the poor. And when I defraud anyone of anything, I pay it back 4 times as much." Zacchaeus, unbeknownst to all of the judgmental people in his community, is already about the work of salvation that Jesus declares. He has already reformed himself. He has already changed. And the good news of this is that you can be stuck in the systems that our world creates that harm people. and yet you can make good out of them. Because you want to be a faithful person, a person who does what God would have you do, a person who wants to see Jesus and who wants to act in the way of Jesus. None of our lives are perfect. None of our churches are perfect. None of our ministries are perfect. We all make mistakes. We're all part of institutions that have problems. We all have to struggle to find out what is the right thing to do. So what does Jesus praise Zacchaeus for, and what would he praise us for? He praises Zacchaeus for trying. And not just trying a little bit. He doesn't praise him. He doesn't praise the people in the crowd, He doesn't praise this crowd for claiming we are not sinners and that man in the tree is a sinner. He praises the man in the tree for doing justice. Jesus says, today salvation has come to this house. And here's the last thing I want us to notice today. Jesus doesn't say, today Zacchaeus has punched his ticket to heaven. That's not what Jesus says. He says, salvation has come to this house. It's a right now thing. The things Zacchaeus is doing are part of his salvation, and not just his salvation, but the salvation of many. Because those possessions that Zacchaeus gives to the poor, and that money he returns to those he has defrauded, intentionally or unintentionally, it helps them. And it repairs the relationship. His community is better. Those who are in need are better off because of Zacchaeus. He's making the best of a bad situation, doing it faithfully, trying to do justice faithfully. And that's what salvation looks like. The repair of the world. The repair of the brokenness. It is not about getting to heaven. It's not even about winning Jesus' approval. It's not about our ancestry or our identity. It's not about the names we claim for ourselves. We are children of Abraham. And so, we have salvation assured for us. It sounds much like I am a Christian. And so I have salvation assured. That is a promise on which we can stand in the darkest times, but it's not the full impact of our salvation. What are we urgently, desperately about in our lives? How relaxed are we in our faith? How relaxed are we in the way we relate to those who we know and don't know in the world around us? Dietrich Bonhoeffer, one of the saints of the 20th century, said that cheap grace is no grace at all. Grace has to be costly. Not because God charges us for it, but because our response to it leads us to a life of costly sacrifice. So what are we about? What was Zacchaeus about? Zacchaeus in this story, this little man, this tax collector, is desperate to see Jesus, even to the point of embarrassment. He's desperate to see Jesus, who he thinks might bring salvation. He's desperate to let this good rabbi know, look what I do. I haven't told anybody else because it would be bragging. And I should not know what my left hand know what my right hand is doing. But I give to the poor, and I try not to defraud anyone. And if I do, I repay them 4 times, much more than any other tax collector does. I'm not trying to justify myself, but I'm proud that I do this. I'm trying. And Jesus says, I see you up in that tree. I see you. who thought you were small, who thought you weren't important, who thought I wouldn't notice. I see what you're trying to do. And salvation has come to your house. We can't just sit in the pews. That is not the good news. We can't just be sure we are part of the in crowd. That is not the good news of Jesus Christ. The good news is costly grace. The good news is a desperation to see justice roll down like waters. That is what we are called to. I wonder, and maybe this is something for you to take into the week ahead. When was it you climbed that tree? Because you wanted to see Jesus so badly. What does your sycamore look like? Where was it? What was the backstory? And what has your faith cost you? Amen.